So a lot of people might think, well, what if I just use incentives? Can I just give people gift cards or give them money to participate in a survey? This is really tricky territory, and this really comes back to ethics, which we've talked about. So when you're thinking about using incentives, you have to think of a few things. You want to be really careful. It doesn't come across as coercion. You don't want people to feel like they're being coerced or kind of forced into doing something they don't want to do. And if you give them a big incentive, that can kind of force people into doing something that they might otherwise not do. So an incentive is not meant to make them participate in a survey they otherwise wouldn't. It's meant to really remove some of the barrier to participation. It doesn't have to be monetary. Incentives can be childcare. They can be a bus pass. They can be the equivalent of a day's worth of work if they have to miss a day's worth of work to be there. You don't want them to feel like they have to depend on you, so that might change the way they answer. So you might just have a neutral person that's the one giving it to them, and you might give them an incentive just for showing up. That way they don't feel like obligated to continue through with the whole research if they want to withdraw. So just consider those risks. If it's really risky research and you give a really big incentive, then that's even more ethically ambiguous. You want to make sure that people, again, aren't being compelled to do something that they might find degrading. And one thing that often gets confused is compensation, especially in types of research like participatory action research, where you've got community members that are involved in teams that are planning a survey. A lot of the times you treat folks in those groups like people of the research team, and you might provide full-blown compensation for their time, which is very different than an incentive for a regular research subject. So what are some of the factors you want to think about? You want to be consistent. If there is a survey out there that you can adapt, use it, adapt it. Most of the greatest surveys we have were designed and adapted from a previous one. Think about the questions. Do you want to make the first question be, how old are you? Tell me your address. Or do you want to start with a simple question like, what do you think about this? And build in more of the specific demographic questions at the end. And you want to make it attractive. Nobody wants to answer something that's too boring, that's too small font, that just doesn't look appealing. So think about this survey. This is the way it's surveyed. It's meant to be filled out by the volunteers, not by the person who's homeless. So examine this survey and ask yourself, how does this meet? How user-friendly is this? How does this respond? What are some of the concerns you might have about this? So let's go through the rules. How can you make sure that you write your survey questions clearly? There's a few general rules, and we're going to go through. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but I am going to ask you to just pause and review them as we go through them, because you're going to see several examples here that are also in the textbook and again, even some people think surveys are just really easy and simple and I can just write questions down, but don't be deceived. You have to put a lot of thought and effort into your questions, and oftentimes you may need to pilot those questions, reread them, have other people read them and ask, does this sound vague to you? Is there any language here that doesn't make sense to you? You might want to pilot them with a very small sample and see, do you ask the same question twice? And if you see a different response, then that lets you know that it might be a confusing language. You might want to go through and ask people, is there anything that's missing in the question? You might want to even pilot it with people. If it's a survey that includes some political questions, you might want to pilot it with a conservative and a liberal audience and see the differences in responses. So these are just the different types of things you need to think about as you're going through and creating your survey. And as I mentioned, you want to make sure you take the time to pilot it. So you may be doing focus groups. You may ask small samples. You may just ask your coworkers and your colleagues to try it out. You may try a questionnaire on a small project before you launch it into a full-blown project. You may compare other studies that have done something similar. So you always want to make sure you test your questionnaire out before you put it through in full-blown research mode. And there are 6 different ways. So once you've come up with the questions you want to ask and how you want to ask them, you have to think about how you're going to administer the survey. Are you going to mail it to people? Are you going to put them into a group and do it together? Do you call them on the phone? Do you sit down and do it one-on-one? Do you have them sit down at a computer and do it? Or do you just email it to them through social media or through just an email list? Each has its advantages and disadvantages. So think of the mailed survey as the one that you receive in the mail. Probably one of the best. There are several rules that you want to think about. The book talks about these, about just some of the important things that you have to do. Mail surveys have probably one of the lowest response rates, so it's not enough ever to just mail it and expect for somebody to fill it out. So there's a lot of different steps that you have to do to really make sure you have the best chance of people filling it out and sending it back. The U.S. Census is probably one of the most well-known surveys, so you might want to check out this video that talks about how the U.S. Census has set up some questions and how that's even led to errors, inaccuracy in the way that they do things.